I really feel that when we talk about a divided nation, people too often want to say it's the Democrats versus the Republicans. But I'm based in North Carolina, and I find that it's much more complicated than that. So often, I believe it's urban areas and cities versus more rural areas. So you see on many issues, say in North Carolina, that Charlotte, Asheville, Raleigh, Durham, Chapel Hill, Greensboro, Winston-Salem, and some of the urban areas and more of the cities are on one side and rural areas are on another. If you look at the vote totals, it's almost strictly divided. And I'd say that that is where the tension is. In the latest issue that probably everyone's heard about, House Bill 2, when the Republican majority in the State House passed a bill limiting the an ordinance that Charlotte had put into place about LGBT rights. And most folks have heard, they call it the bathroom bill because it had to do with letting folks use the bathroom of the gender with which they identify. But actually, the bill had much more in it than that. So the state bill limited how cities could set their own discrimination ordinances and set things like minimum wage. And so you saw that tension there, where it was pretty much the state telling cities, not so fast. You have to follow what we want you to follow. And then you saw tensions from the cities saying, well, we are the economic engines. We are where a lot of the companies come and locate. And so we really want to do this. And actually, the whole state did end up suffering because many companies and sports and athletic events started boycotting the state because of it. And I think folks got an interesting image of North Carolina that may not necessarily be true, because if you come here and you're in a city, it does seem fairly progressive in so many ways. And the folks in the rural areas aren't particularly, they're not intolerant, but it's a clash of different cultures. And that's why one reason it's a great news state to live in. It makes it interesting, but it also can sometimes be exhausting. Well, you could say that there's a division in many states across the country. And to take North Carolina as an example, you've seen a back and forth. It was thought of a New South progressive city, state rather. The city of Charlotte elected its first African American mayor, Harvey Gantt, in the 80s. And he ran two close and very divisive races for the Senate that he lost to Jesse Helms. And you saw the division there. And Barack Obama won the state by a hair in 2008, lost it to Romney by a hair in 2012, and it is now a battleground, and it will continue to be like states such as Virginia, Ohio, and other states. So you do see this trend all over the country, and you see a lot of bills that are in the courts here that are mirrored throughout the country. All of these voting bills that have restricted the vote after the Supreme Court did invalidate parts of the Voting Rights Act a few years ago. And you see that going back and forth. You see redistricting in the courts around the country where states have redistrict parts of the state so that it protects the folks who are in office, whether they're Republican or Democratic. And so we get a much more diverse country. It's growing, and different factions are looking to probably protect what they have, particularly in times that are perceived of economic insecurity. So I'd say North Carolina is just one example. And you see it play out on the national stage where compromise across lines, you see it less and less. Now, many Republicans are saying Democrats should get over it. They lost the election, and now it's our turn to govern. But then a few years ago, you saw a lot of obstruction when Barack Obama was elected president. And Mitch McConnell famously said, our focus is going to be to make him a one-term president. Not our focus is going to be to help the American citizens do the best that they can. And we see these partisan battles and a certain amount of gridlock. And it's difficult sometimes for citizens to see this back and forth. But we still keep voting these folks in. So my son is a historian, and he reminds me that this is nothing new in the history of the United States, that there's always, we have a certain amount of progress, then there's been pushback, and you'll see this ebb and this flow. So, he kind of puts it in perspective for me that it's not something that just happened, but it's something that we've seen throughout the arc of history in this country.
I just want to say that I really did enjoy listening to your post. It's really good that you threw it out there for all of us to understand what's going on. It's very important. Thank you so much.
Well, since you are part of the media, I have to ask, are you now looking for pointers on how to further divide our country? Um, and the reason I ask this is I definitely believe the media has most of the things going on that contributed to our division. Just as you used in your own post here, how you divided groups up: rural, city, Democrat, Republican, minority, majority. Just as you divided everyone up into little boxes, you have divided everyone into their own categories, and then you guys tend to put one against the other, the majority against the minority. You guys do this all the time, and this is what creates division, part of the division. The other thing is all the media today, such as what you just did here, wasn't news. It was opinionated news. It was your take of the news. See, the news isn't news anymore. The news is someone's opinion on what is going on. It's not reported news. And yes, division has always been around election time, and however, we always seem to come together. But this election cycle in particular, the division is going on and on and on, and just downright lies and strong opinions are being reported instead of actual, factual news. And this is why your whole industry should be ashamed of itself. And this is why your whole industry is slowly but surely destroying itself. People hear things on the news now and they're like, they question it and everything about it. Anybody has any brain cells in their head does. It used to be if you heard it on the news, it was real. It happened. Had to happen. Saw it on the news. Now you hear something on the news and you're like, I don't know about all this. So keep on hanging yourselves, and we'll sit back and watch the show. But please try not to destroy our country in the meantime.
That makes sense. I mean, you could even take it one step further and say uh, service distribution. So, services are distributed mainly to urban areas, especially for support services for marginalized populations.
I think when we talk about America being divided, there are a lot of pieces that have to be considered. Historically, we have to ask the question, when hasn't America actually been divided? Even during times of tranquility and peace in this country, there were divides, substantial divides. It's just that people were either from fear or societal pressures prevented from acting out or voicing the divide. For example, when America was founded, there was slavery. Black people in the Constitution were counted as 3/5 of a person. Only white property-owning men had substantial rights. And by property owning, they didn't mean people with mortgages, because that wasn't a concept the way it is today. The founding fathers, for all the good they did, were not champions of democracy. they didn't believe in the will of the people, and other than the people being them, rich, white men. And so the country was founded on pretty significant divides. The other period people refer to, the Greatest Generation, World War II. America's liberating army in World War II was segregated. Black people had fundamentally almost no rights, and in the South, no rights, really. Japanese people were rounded up, stripped of their property, their possessions, their money, and thrown into camps strictly because they were Japanese. Franklin Roosevelt, the reported hero of the working class, the champion of the New Deal, realized that America would not allow him to be president if most people knew he had a serious quote-unquote disability. And so Roosevelt did his best to hide his polio and its effect on him. After the war, millions of women who proved themselves capable in all kinds of employment settings were shamed or physically forced out of jobs and back into what many of them considered a subservient pre-war life. So the question is, when hasn't America been divided? And addressing today's division, the premise of this question is, of course, right. The divide largely is rural and urban. And what's sad about that is that the rural and urban areas of America have more in common than they have uncommon. And the greatest link between them is poverty, lack of opportunity, and a failing educational system. And when we think about that, we have to figure, if these people have so much in common, and if a system that improved education, that improved opportunity, job training, brought jobs, good paying jobs back to America, would benefit both of these people, why do they not vote the same way? And the answer, unfortunately, is a very simple one. Far too often, rural voters vote against their own best interest. They have been conditioned to mistrust a government, to vote on social issues, to care about abortion, same-sex marriage, and things that don't really impact their day-to-day life, and that honestly the banker class doesn't really care about. But the banker class will pay lip service to it, so these people will keep voting for the banker class to hold office, so the banker class can refuse to regulate Wall Street, curb business excess, rein in corporate pollution, and the like. And so it really is an issue of education and outreach. And to be completely fair about this, too many liberal, as we call them today, unfortunately, liberal elites, a term which I revile because we're, in a sense, saying that being educated is a negative. Liberal elites have far too often dismissed rural voters and not attempted to find common ground, dismissed them as too religious, too conservative, too educated. The worst among the liberal elites will say too dumb, not worth the effort. And if you don't believe this, look at what's happening in terms of religion throughout the South and the rural Midwest. Most of the mainline large denominational churches, Evangelical Lutheran Church of America, Presbyterians, and whatnot, are pulling out of those areas because they're not considered profitable enough. And what's springing up all over the South are these so-called non-denominational churches that are being run by pastors who got their certification to be pastors off the internet for a few dollars. And they have no business really leading people. No training, very little education. And it really is who is the most charismatic, who is willing to go in there and do and say what the people want to hear. And so instead of leading these communities, these people have to say what the community wants to hear. And so they're not in a position to help the community modernize, either from a spiritual perspective, an economic perspective, or a social perspective. And so this is a very complicated issue. But I think the media errs when it focuses on this idea that we are more divided than ever, that the divide is historic, because it's not. In many ways, the divide is smaller than it has been in past American history. But it is a substantial divide, and its roots are obvious. Its remedies are pretty clear. What's totally not clear is if there are enough people who actually care enough about the country to try and solve these problems, because solving them would be, to a large extent, at the expense of the political ideology put forth by our broken two-party political system.